I am going to take you through a couple of slides. I'm going to talk about this guy this morning. And by the way, if any of you want a copy of the slides, just feel free. I put my email address at the end of the slide deck. Just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides if that's of interest. Now, you may not realize it, but this is the face of every entrepreneur. It's also the face of Virgin Media, but actually I got it first. So, but this is the way that every entrepreneur feels inside. And we never forget at Ariadne, we have about 100 different companies come to us every single month, of which we sit down with as many as we can, but about 20 to 30. And we had 500 at our Entrepreneur Country Forum last Wednesday, that this is the face of the entrepreneur and the way that they feel inside. The more that you tell them that they can't do something, the more they just smile and they say, you know, I'm going to show you. And we have a mantra at Ariadne Capital, follow the entrepreneur. And in my book, Welcome to Entrepreneur Country, I talk about society should be organized around the entrepreneur. And what I don't mean by that is that everybody is meant to be an entrepreneur, because clearly that's not the case. Not everybody can be an entrepreneur. Not everybody is actually set up to do that. Not everybody can handle the stress of it, to be frank. But we do feel that society should be organized around the entrepreneur, and that's what I write about in my book. And we think, and I believe really passionately, that we need to follow the entrepreneur, no more so than right now. And there's really two reasons why we should do that. And two good reasons why we should follow the entrepreneur is that they see things which they see as inevitable. So they have, by virtue of maybe they were socialized a different way, they traveled a lot when they were kids, or they have a unique talent, or they worked in a business where they saw something that the rest of society has not seen and understood. So they're early, right? They see the future early, and they cannot believe that it hasn't happened yet. And so they feel just compelled to bring it to life, right? But there's a lot of people, actually, who could say that and who could be in that position. The second reason why we really need to follow the entrepreneur in society is the second point, is that there's a certain group of people that are willing to live abnormal lives to bring that reality to life. And those are people, you might call them workaholics, you might say they have no personal life, you might say all sorts of things, but for them it's completely and utterly normal because they are obsessed, utterly obsessed. And I'm going to talk about that obsession a little bit later. So in the entrepreneur's eye, they have already won. They've got that prize. It's less about the money. It's about the impact on society. They see the concrete manifestation of what they have done already as a reality. And that's what drives them, is to just ensure that they bring that to real reality. Now, when I was 21 years old, I went to Paris. I went to Paris right after university, and I remember studying French as one of my minors at university, and it was an échec total, and I couldn't handle it, and so I said, right, I'm going to go to France and work on my French. And I remember and granted, I probably made it quite difficult for myself by going where I didn't speak the language, but without any kind of home turf advantage. Right out of university in a very unstructured environment, etc. I was just struggling. I was just trying to figure out, how do I break through? What am I meant to do? And I just remember over the period of the first year or two becoming completely and utterly obsessed about having no money. I just thought, I don't get it. I don't understand how I'm supposed to move forward, and how do you get to the point where you have some serious money to do things and so forth. And I remember my boyfriend at the time got so tired of hearing me talk about not having any money that he said at one point, he just said, stop talking about money, Julie. If you're good at what you're doing, if you're doing what you're meant to do, if you're executing and communicating that, the money will find you. And I remember thinking that was the stupidest thing that I had ever heard, and I told him so. But what is so true is the past 25 years have been example after example and exercise after exercise of the money finding me. The less I focus on it, the more I focus on my unique contribution to the world, the more I focus on First Tuesday, the more I focus on Ariadne, the more I focus on Entrepreneur Country, and just be totally obsessed with executing and communicating my unique contribution to the world, the more the money finds me. Now, I was at the Cambridge Phenomena Conference where I was the mistress of ceremonies a couple years ago, celebrating 50 years of Cambridge. And David Rue, who is the chairman of Silver Lake Partners, happened to be one of the speakers. And he said something, and I kind of, it's very Silver Lake Partners and rather American, but it works for me. He said, money is like a heat-seeking missile. It's just searching globally for where it can get the best return. Okay, that's great if you have like 10 billion under management, but I think it really is relevant in so many situations. We need to remember that capital follows ideas. It always has, and it always will. And as we were going into the downturn in kind of 2008 and 2009, I remember thinking to myself, it would be really good if more people could go to entrepreneur country, because entrepreneurs feel that they go to a different country every day, where nobody can really understand the pressure of being an entrepreneur, dealing with the bank pulling your overdraft, not having the money to make payroll, people not showing up and pretending that they're sick, and and entrepreneurs bond with each other by going to entrepreneur country every day. But I remember just thinking, as it got more and more worse in this kind of crud that we saw coming out of the financial services industry, I remember thinking, gosh, more people really need to go to entrepreneur country to understand the reality of building wealth, not just playing with other people's money. And as we continued through that financial crisis and so forth, I started to realize that we are all going to entrepreneur country. Not because I think it's a good idea or whatever, but society is changing. There's a structural change which is happening between business, government, and the individual. And we are all going to entrepreneur country. And again, that's what I write about in my book, but that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. If we look back in history, then, we go back to Michelangelo, Christopher Columbus. That group of people who have been entrepreneurs have always been there. Is it 5%? Is it 17%? Whatever percentage of the population, which are totally focused on the future, right? That have the face of that little guy inside of them. They weren't always called entrepreneurs. They were called industrialists. They were called creators. They were called adventurers. They sailed across the ocean to find the New World. They painted the Sistine Chapel. But that group of people who we call today entrepreneurs have always been there in society. And what is clear with the benefit of history is to see that it is, in fact, the job of the money, whether that money is the Medici family or Queen Isabella. It's the job of the money to find the entrepreneur of the day, right? That's my job as the managing partner of the Ariadne Fund. It's indeed why I get myself out of bed to come to see you on a Sunday morning, or why we host Entrepreneur Country, as we did last week, and why I love to travel around to meet, because my job is to find the entrepreneurs that we are going to back. And I'm always very surprised whenever I go to wherever I go, Newcastle, Bristol, and people say, we don't have that many London-based venture capitalists coming up to see us and so forth. And I think, how can they not? That's their job. Their job is to get out and to meet the money, to meet the entrepreneurs, to back the industrialists of the day, not to wait for them to show up at their black marble offices in Mayfair. So very much believe, just like my friend who told me when I was 23 years old, the money will find you. I actually really believe that as you're building your businesses or considering, or maybe you join a startup and so forth, don't be obsessed about the money. It will be obsessive enough for you to have to deal with cash flow crises, etc. But the most important thing is to remember to execute and communicate your vision. And if it's the right one, if you're doing a good job, then the money is there. It's trying to find you. And I really do believe that. So, remember the new economy. For those of you, when I came to the United Kingdom 15 years ago, right after INSEAD, I came up in late 97, early 1998, and the very first deal that I did was helping Brent and Martha with lastminute.com. And I remember everybody was talking about the so-called new economy. Well, it turns out it's only the latest version of new. Now, how many of you have heard of Carlota Perez? I'll be very impressed if we've got a lot of Carlota Perez readers here. Anybody? So that's the second book for your reading list after you read my book, is Carlota Perez's Theory of Disruptive Technology. I've been mentioning her so much that I think they're going to have to republish the book, because it's quite an interesting framework, and a lot of our investment framework is based on her. But Carlota Perez is a Venezuelan economist, and she went out in 1971, she went out to Silicon Valley. She was studying oil, as you do if you're a Venezuelan economist, and what she found instead was the Intel microprocessor, which exploded into the scene in 1971, this big bang of disruptive technology, and she was fascinated. And being a historical economist, she very helpfully looked at the past 300 years or so and realized that there was a pattern. She was a pattern recognizer. And as you can see from this chart, there has been a moment, a disruptive technology, many of which have originated in the United Kingdom, and then it ushers in a period, right? And she's given a name to that age, and we can, I think we can spot history, but she's created a kind of structure to it, which I think is quite important because it shows that a lot of what's happening is only the latest version of new, right? We're in our 60-year cycle, driven from that initial disruptive technology. And it turns out, according to Carlota, but frankly it makes sense to me the more I've kind of looked into this and thought about history and so forth, that within each of those 60 to 70-year cycles, and I think the one that we're in is going to be longer than that, by the way, is that there's kind of 4 distinct stages. You have the big bang of disruptive technology, and then you have the installation of new technologies, right? Then you go through a turning point, and at the end of that installation of new technologies, the first half of the cycle, you have the money looking for, so much new opportunity for it to invest in that it goes crazy, and the money starts to make money off of money. Sound familiar? That's what we've been going through the past 10 years, because there's not enough of the new economy for the money to pursue. Then you go through the turning point, which Carlota Perez would say is a particularly long turning point because of this sorting out of the money, into the second half of the cycle, which you see here, and that's all about the deployment of these new technologies into big business, right? So you have the Big Bang, and look at some of those well-known companies. All of those were really about the installation, the whole computing industry, the whole software industry, the internet. All of those are derivative. Very few things are, in my opinion, actually disruptive. Most of it, many of them can be game changers, but that's different than a fundamentally disruptive technology. Most are derivative technologies. And frankly, when people come to Ariadne and say, I've got a disruptive technology, we say, well, we're the wrong place for you then, because we don't believe that this is a moment of disruptive technology at all. And we're going through a kind of extended turning point, but you can definitely see the second half of the cycle. So the revolution, and it is a revolution because from the beginning to the end of the cycle, a whole new common sense is emerging, right? And in any revolution, the point of a revolution is that a new common sense emerges. The revolution starts as a small fact because not everybody in Silicon Valley understood what was happening in 1971, and certainly not everybody around the world. But it has great promise. It has great economic promise, right? And we're going to talk more about that and what society understands of that promise and moves to become a significant force in the market. So the Big Bang attracts new investment, and that fourth bullet point there is the one that I really want you to remember, as that this new common sense is emerging, because that's where I think the big opportunity in the market is. And what you have is the wheels of society, the institutions, all of them, from the Moody's rating service to the financial institutions, the social economic institutions are all changing right now as the structural change, the social contract which binds us together between individuals, government, and business has shattered. It's not the same as it was even at the end of World War II, but even 10 years ago. And a new one is emerging as this new common sense emerges, driven by the impact of technology in our lives. Now, if I had to say that without the benefit of help from Carlota Perez, I would say when I came to the UK and I worked on lastminute.com, and not just Brent and Martha, but indeed most of the internet entrepreneurs at that time, they really felt, and they kind of acted like they were David with their slingshot, right? And they were going to assassinate and annihilate the establishment, and it was all just, going to be great. And it didn't really happen that way, did it? Right? We had a couple that survived and became the big Goliaths, but not all of them did. What I think is happening, though, today is that David and Goliath must dance. If we think through the dot-com downturn, 2001 and 2, which I remember very, very clearly because it was the first 2 years of Ariadne Capital. I remember saying to myself, what have I done? You know, I could have gone to Italy for 3 years and just kind of waited this out. But there we were, plugging away, right? And I'm very glad that we did, by the way, because that's how we were there in the market when we met Nicholas Zenstrom and started working with Skype when there were 5 people, right? So ultimately, with the benefit of time, I understood why we set up Ariadne so quickly. Or in the financial downturn of 2008 and 9, none of us stopped using broadband mobile technologies. These just, if anything, they increased. Their penetration into our lives accelerated, right? So there's no correlation between how technology steamrolls into our lives and what's happening in the financial markets. People like to look at the two as correlated, but they're not. Fundamentally, they're not. And what we are right now is in a situation where David, who understands the future, and Goliath, who represents existing traditional economy, must dance. And Goliath is pretty damn important because that's the 9/10 of the iceberg, which is kind of underneath the table that you might not see, but it is being remade with digital business models and software. So, the consumerization of technology is behind this, and for this group of people, that's really very obvious. But if you deal with the Goliaths, because part of our business is to work with corporates who are all trying to figure out digital right now, they don't necessarily understand that all new products and services are adopted by consumers first, and then ultimately, transmitted across businesses. And that still is the number one thing. And the reason why digital natives or people who are in their 20s have such a massive opportunity inside of corporates to be a David inside of a corporate, helping them become a high-growth business, as well as just setting up their own businesses and being in startup mode. A third book for your reading list, after my book and Carlotta's book, is Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. But you need to have a stiff drink or lots of coffee or really be a persistent kind of person to make it through this one, because this is quite an academic tome. But he says, and you've probably seen this before, he talks about that 89 years for the fixed line telephone to achieve adoption of 150 million users, 38 years for television, mobile phone achieved it in 14 years, iPod in 7, Facebook in 5, and you can see where this is going. We're talking about the exponential effect of how technology drives adoption and distribution, right? And that is really critical because our minds work linearly and technology grows exponentially, right? And so what that tells me is a number of things. But as humans, we need to create the rules of engagement for society, because you can see where this is going in terms of technology driving the rules of engagement. And if we don't set up that social contract, understanding how we want to leverage technology as a positive force for good, then other things could clearly happen. So this David and Goliath model, this is kind of an internal working document at Ariadne, but I like to wheel it out here because it's quite important for me. My entire business is on this grid. Everything that we do and every way that we look at companies, we're backing out of our fund the digital enablers, the Davids, right? Those digital enablers are enabling technology and tools businesses that are going to transform those big Goliath industries. They need the distribution of a Tesco, of a Barclays, of a N. Brown, of a Paddy Power, right? The digital enablers are the cars. They need a highway, right? And we feel that we have to be working on both sides of the problem. We can't just be investing and hoping that these guys get deals done with Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, whoever, but we need to help them get on that highway. And I think that's where, frankly where a lot of venture firms fail to understand the full sweep of what they need to do to help companies grow. Likewise, though, the corporates fail to understand sometimes that their chief asset is their distribution, right? And they get told by a lot of investment bankers to just buy companies, right, or to create big investment funds, or by consultants to say, well, we'll do the thinking for you. You don't even need to grapple with the problem. But there's no shortcut to understanding what's happening in the market. And the corporates and the Goliaths, no matter which industry they're in, from chemicals to financial services to newspapers, et cetera, they have to do the hard thinking of how do we find a systematic way to engage with digital and to engage with the Davids, the digital enablers, right? So you can see that at the beginning, vulnerability, huge vulnerability in a network world. It's always vulnerable to be a startup. But in a network world where you're trying to organize a series of stakeholders to come together in a transaction, you're even more vulnerable today. There's many things which are good about setting up a startup today, but in terms of the business models that we think will win, there's a lot of things which are much, much tougher. So some companies, actually, as they go across the grid, trying to get to that upper left-hand corner, network effects. The network effects is lock-in, right? Lock-in, which means that you've got such a good market position that you really can't, get swept away with the tide of the market anymore. Some of these companies articulate, and the digital enablers tend to be of huge strategic value to the Goliaths, right? So up in the upper left-hand corner, you've got strategic value. Very few of them make it all the way to the financial value, right? They get acquired or they go out of business before they ever achieve. And I'm going to give you an example of both today. But the promise is, as they do, when partnering, they bring new digital revenues to Goliath. And that is the dance which is happening right now, is how digital enablers are bringing those digital revenues to every piece of that big iceberg, the Goliath businesses. And you see these David and Goliath deals all over the market. I'm going to tell you more about Monetize, but you might have picked up on the Yoox PPR deal. PPR is Francois Pinault, the fashion empire, right? And he did a very clever deal with Yoox, which was one of the earliest .com. It was an Italian retailer set up by Net Partners. The first venture capital fund focused on internet in Europe was an Italian firm called Net Partners in 1996. $5 million made some of the best internet investments, and Yoox was one of them. Yoox is now well over 100 million euros of revenue, and as a digital enabler, working with PPR, the fashion empire, again, right, leveraging car on highway and so forth. And these, we're just going to continue to see more and more of them. PPR didn't buy Yoox. This was a commercial partnership, leveraging the distribution for the digital enablers and the understanding of how to create those digital revenues. So, said another way, Marc Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, his take on what Carlota Perez is doing, he said software is eating the world. And I'm sure you've all heard this because it's such a big statement. First came out in August 2011 in the Wall Street Journal. But he said that all business is being remade by software, and that's really true. So given all of that, what's the investment opportunity? Well, we think about all of that. We think we have a cunning plan. So we at Ariadne Capital never forget that innovation is about economics, not technology. Otherwise, we'd all be flying the Concorde, right? We're not. We're stuffed into jumbo jets, right? That's just one example of why economics are driving. So we think it's fair to say this is a moment of disruptive economics, but it's not about disruptive technology, but it is about disruptive economics. Now, if there's one point that would really encourage you to focus on, and again, I'm just saying this because I think it's so obvious, but I want you to just kind of think about it for a moment, is there is a fundamental network orientation, not just to business, frankly, to all of life. Everything that used to be linear or hierarchical has gone network. And what that means, it means a lot of things, actually. It means that sticks don't work. In a network world, you can't impose yourself on somebody, except through economics. You can only influence, you can use carrots effectively, but carrots, not sticks. And what it also means is that every transaction has multiple stakeholders. And if you're not thinking that way, and this is why David wins so frequently in his battle with Goliath. In the asymmetrical game of warfare, David wins so consistently because he understands the network orientation to business better. Goliath is still dealing with the fact that his supply chain is set up linearly, and he or she still thinks that he can impose himself, like the record industry, on the artist, right? Saying, we're big, you're small, deal with it. We will determine how music happens. And so, as a result, the entire music industry goes to Macworld today, right? Because somebody else said, we recognize there's a creator of music, there's a consumer of music, there's distribution for music, and we, Apple, will create a set of economics where everybody takes a share of it, right? And so it is the person who creates those economics that drives the win. So whether or not you're in a Goliath business or a David business, or you're just kind of thinking about it, but when it gets difficult, and it frequently gets difficult, and I ask myself this question sometimes, I say, how do I make it in other people's interests for me to be successful? Who are my natural allies, right? And you have to ask yourself who your natural allies are in a network world, right? Because in a network world, you can't do it on your own. It's not a question of how many hours you work. It's not a question of how smart you are. You have to identify who your natural allies are. And then you have to ask yourself, how do I make it in their interest for me to be successful, for them to pull me into the market? Now, your natural allies could be people that you formerly competed with. They could be very unsexy people or companies. They could be companies that need a new story. They could be very unlikely candidates, but everybody has natural allies. It's just not everybody asks a question. And not everybody actually does the hard work of saying, how do I make it in their interest to pull me into the market? Those can be infrequently economic and financial incentives, but they don't have to be. They could be recognition for their role in the industry. It could be many different things, but that's the key question and the key exercise that you need to do. So if we think about Google for just a moment, Google says that they organize the world's information, and indeed they do, but they do a lot more than that, don't they? They actually organize the economics of the world's information. And they use our data, albeit aggregated and anonymously, right? But they have created a multi-billion-pound company. Market capitalization is driven by those economics. And yet we get no upside, no economic upside for the use, for the fact that we are part of the central transaction which drives 95% of the profits of Google. We are part of that transaction. We are one of the stakeholders, and yet we get nothing for it, right? Free search. And they're making a calculated bet that people are not going to wake up to it. And I thought for a very long time that their Achilles heel would be if another entrepreneur came up with, because it would have to be another entrepreneur who would come up with a superior set of economics for that transaction. And I found that entrepreneur. His name is John Paleomolites. He's a British entrepreneur who was running a business called Beat That Quote. And Beat That Quote, actually, were giving a cashback deal to individuals for the use of their data. Doesn't sound particularly revolutionary. We've all heard of cashback deals. But what John was doing, he was executing that his version of the same transaction, giving an economic upside to the individual, that when Google came looking over the market for people to leverage their distribution, they didn't go to Money Supermarket. They went to Little Beat That Quote, and they made them an offer. For a company with only 250,000 pounds of EBITDA, we sold the business for 37.7 million sterling, a 122 times EBITDA multiple. Now, Google has a lot of money, but you don't do that unless your fundamental business model is challenged, right? So back to that David and Goliath grid, that's where you have huge strategic value, right? Is that you can articulate that strategic value to Google to say, actually, this is where it's going. The individual is demanding that their data has an economic upside and value, and that's what we bring to you. Monetize. How many of you are users of Monetize services? Through your bank, you are aware that they are using Monetize for mobile banking. Anyone? Wow. This is the third fastest growing company in this country, guys. Yeah. So Monetize is basically enabling the banks to get into the world of mobile banking. Alistair Lukey, the CEO and founder, said a very, very, very basic thing 10 years ago when he set up the business, and I met him more or less at that time. He said, if this is going to work, meaning mobile banking, it has to work for everyone, right? Now, again, that doesn't sound earth-shatteringly lightning bolt or whatever, but he said, if mobile banking is going to work, it has to work for everyone. He was thinking about the ecosystem and what he has created, because your money is in your bank. He's saying you don't need to move your money to a card. You don't need to move it to a special account like PayPal. Your money is in your bank, and you should be able, through any bank, agnostic bank, device, mobile carrier, transfer, transact, etc., with the money where your money is, in the bank. He said, we're going to help those banks participate in that digital money, mobile money space. But what was different is that he said, we're going to give a share of the revenue to the mobile carrier. We're obviously going to incentivize the bank, and we're going to lower the cost of capital for the individual who is charged 22% by Western Union if you're poor, right? So he was thinking about the overall ecosystem, all of his natural allies, and did the hard work of building a set of ecosystem economics, which ultimately has pulled him into the market, right? But it wasn't easy. This has been a 10-year plan. Yes, they've raised $200 million. Yes, they bought their U.S. competitor. Yes, they've been backed by Visa 5 times. But there were many points along the way that it looked like game over, right? And I'll never forget getting a text message in July 2006 from Alistair. This is when they were still part of Morse, the systems integrator, before they had delisted and relisted in their own name as Monetize. Text message said very simply, 119 meetings, 76 nights away from my wife, but we have a client. That's obsession. That's not normal, right? But that's what it takes to get a client creating a whole new industry. And that's the hard work, and that's the reason why not everybody's meant to be a David. That's the reason why not everybody becomes a global leader, is because very few people are as persistent and driven as Alistair Lukey's. Monetize is very much a company that you should spend some time looking at. It's going to become one of the most important companies in banking. It is the third fastest growing company in this country, and Alistair Lukey's is a phenomenal individual. And we have learned so much about what we do today in investing, frankly, but just by seeing his extraordinary drive to build mobile money globally. So he sits right there. Monetize sits as the enabler, right at the heart of the ecosystem. And every single transaction that flows through, he takes a cut. It doesn't get more beautiful than that as a business model. I'm going to flip through these slides here pretty quickly here. So the 5 stages of company development are quite important because people somehow think that, it's not structured, but it is. The first phase, the phase 1, I call the Saturday night dinner party phase, because everybody has an idea on Saturday night dinner party. In fact, I was at a Saturday night dinner party last night, and somebody else said, I have this great idea. But very few people do anything with their Saturday night dinner party ideas. Some people turn that insight that they have into consumer behavior into a product. And that's really what a product is a unique insight into consumer behavior. Remember that consumerization of technology. And they say, I believe that it's going to work like this, and they create a product. And you must separate that out from how you tax it, your business model. That's phase 3. Because what many people do is they lump it together, and then they can't figure out why is it not working. Is it a bad consumer insight, or is it a bad business model? So you do need to stage it. You can be moving really quickly, but you need to isolate out whether or not the product's working before you get to the business model, right? And overall, what you need to do in phases 1, 2, and 3 is you need to determine who your natural allies are and that circle of people who are going to make sure that you stay aligned and go to market. Because by the time you get to phase 4, you can't actually not know. You've got to know who your natural allies are. You have to have people who care about you, because when you are in rapid growth mode, which is what phase 4 is, and you are hurtling through the atmosphere, but not yet in your natural orbit in the market, that's phase 5. If you've got parts which are not working, they just start spinning off the rocket, right? And I saw that most spectacularly, actually, with a company called Spinvox that had raised 50 million sterling, that had done 33 operator deals. It thought it could see already its impact in the market, but it had a lot of things where it were not bedded down, and the alignment and the circle of people that it needed to help it through phase 4 were not there. And it was the most amazing bust up in the atmosphere I've ever seen. And so what you need to do is you need to build that team, build that circle of people, find and identify your natural allies and be working with them as you're expanding in phase 4. So in 2013, network benefits accrue to those firms who understand their role in the ecosystem and organize the economics for it. This in turn leads to exceptional returns for their shareholders. That's my book. You can get it on Amazon. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about this morning, I talk in a little bit more detail with few more anecdotes in the book. But I think it's, again, an invitation. You know, I thought at first I was going to call the book A Day in Entrepreneur Country. And my editor, my publisher, he said, Julie, what you've issued here is an invitation. And for those of us who are entrepreneurs, we desperately want everybody to come to Entrepreneur Country as quickly as possible. We want to help society understand it needs to organize itself around the entrepreneur, because technology is a layer which is lifting and creating prosperity. It's expanding the pie. It's not an industry. Just like finance gives you the ability to be high growth, so does technology and your ability to communicate what you're doing. But the sooner we understand these things in broader society, and I would argue there's not enough of a discussion in the national media at all. So most people are scared by what's happening in the economy. They're scared, and they have, I think, fairly irrelevant discussions about how to create growth, but they don't understand what they can do to embrace and how technology is trying to help build a bigger pie. But lest we think this is all about business, it's really not. It's about the broader society, and many people would not refer to themselves as entrepreneurs. Many people would say, well, that's an Alistair Lukes, or that's a Charles Dunstone, or Richard Branson. But this quote came from Iqbal Kadir, the founder of the Grameen phone, and I first misquoted him, which is how I got to know him. And then we sorted that out, and I got the quote right. But he said, capitalism was about empowered authority, which didn't necessarily activate the citizenry. The internet stands that on its head and shifts the power to the individual, making individual capitalism the force for the 21st century. Right? So there's not just capitalism. It's about individual capitalism. It's about figuring out what your unique contribution is to the world and then delivering that as an individual capitalist. And I would argue that we just can't afford to not have people understand these things. We can't afford to have people who are not net contributors to growing an entrepreneur country with ecosystem economics and understanding the things that I have been sharing with you this morning. Because I really think it's very, very simple. I think we do need to follow the entrepreneur. He or she has the market insight, is the creator of value, and is the hero. So with that, you've got my email address. I hope that you become a citizen, a native, not a tourist in Entrepreneur Country. If you're interested in our kind of finance program, which starts from startup loans through crowdfunding to our fund, etc., then you should shoot Olivia Gray an email. And if there's a new opportunity that you want to bring it, drop me an email, send it to New Opportunity, and so forth. But thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Julie, for the talk. We'd like to open up some questions from the audience.
Great. I just remembered I said Olivia Gray, but the EC team is Entrepreneur Country team. She's part of that EC team email. So please.
Hello, my name is Fedor. Thank you for the talk. You mentioned Beat That Quote, the startup that was looking like disruptive to Google, and it seems that they exited too early. What are your goals when you invest in a startup?
They're multifold, actually. It's a good question. I think I'm very aware of the fact, having sold my First Tuesday to an Israeli venture fund in July 2000, there were businesses, as that market downturn was swooping around the world, we were able to do that. I didn't want to sell, by the way, that business, but I'm just, having thought about it for 12 years. There were businesses still in France that were going public after July. There were venture funds that were being raised in late 2000 in Israel, in places like that. What I'm trying to say is timing is very important. And you need to, it's interesting to say Beat That Quote sold too early because there are a lot of companies that persist, right? And then they fall off a cliff, right? So the other thing that could have happened with First Tuesday is it might not have survived the downturn, right? A lot of people credit us with having sold at the right time. I actually think that John, with our help, did a really good deal. He demonstrated, it was his second startup, and part of the reason why he negotiated as if he was completely unconcerned whether or not he made money. And the head of Google M&A globally said to me, does he not realize how much money he's going to make here? Because he's acting like he doesn't want to get this deal done. But that's how you do it, right? We actually sent, as the advisor, we sent a proposal to Google saying that this little business with 250,000 pounds of EBITDA was worth 100 million sterling. And everybody kind of fell over, laughing and irritated. But that enabled John to come back and say, I'll sell it for 40, right? Whereas at the beginning of the exercise, he thought 8 to 10, but he said, Jules, you can get me 12, right? So everything is relative. Overall, I think that he has crystallized his credentials as one of the smartest people in consumer financial services, having worked for Larry Page, etc. I think that that's quite important. He was the most senior person outside of California in terms of running a product group. And now he's positioned to back, and he is, by the way, other financial services entrepreneurs in this country. So I think that was a good deal, actually. Could it have? We'll never know, right? That's an alternative reality, what could have happened. But if you look at Monetize, which has made its way across that David and Goliath grid and is creating real financial value, again, there was an alternative reality as well, probably. I'm not insider in the company. But it shifted when they bought their U.S. competitor, and they started consolidating the market. I think we need both. We need both. We don't want to just, part of what I didn't get into venture capital to just sell to U.S. technology firms. That's not why I did that, and that's part of why we work with corporates, is to help them open themselves up as enterprise platforms, and for us to have more headquarter-backed companies like Monetize that are global leaders, right? So there's different, and what our goal is to, what's best for all ecosystem economics, what's best for everybody involved, and how do we create more headquarter-backed companies, how do we make more money, how do we drive that message of technology as a layer out there in the market, right? So there's multiple financial, strategic, social, emotional things that we go after when we invest. Good question. Yes? Sorry.
Thanks for your very good speech. And it's easy, like I've been working on a few ideas, and it's easy to come up with an idea to take it to a product stage. But when you go beyond it, when you start making a business model out of it or financial model out of it, that's where I think most of us struggle. Yeah. What would your advice be in that? Where should we go? Where can we find that sort of information?
Well, you knew I was going to say this, but read the book, right? Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is all in business model. I try to give lots of examples. The big thing that you have going for you, the big thing that you have going for you, and the reason why David wins, is Goliath underestimates David, right? So the number of situations where and that's what keeps me going, is because it's just so damn exciting to see a little guy, right, storm through a market. When we started working with Nicholas Zenstrom, we knew he was a pretty special guy, but I could never have predicted in 2 years' time he would have gone through, from 5 people to 2.5 billion. You kind of never get over it when you see it, right? Explosive growth is totally addictive. So, what I would say is you need to just read, internalize, iterate. There's no shortcut, right? If you're smart, if you have that unique unfair advantage in your industry, you surround yourself with the people that you trust. You're thinking ecosystem economics. And what I mean by that, you stand back and you say, how should this industry work? That's what I say all the time about the financing of entrepreneurship, which is my industry. How should it work? Who are my natural allies? How do I make it in their interest for me to be successful? You look at a company like LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn at some point, because Reid Hoffman was doing things in and about that before LinkedIn, he had the idea, he created a product which is clearly understood the network orientation to business. He got the business model right, he went through rapid growth mode, but remember when they went public, everybody was just, despite the fact that the company had $91 million of profit in the first quarter, the year that they went public, people are like, how did this happen? Is this another dot-com, boom, bust, et cetera, right? It's because so many of those Goliaths underestimated them. The entire media industry, the entire recruitment. His consumer insight was that people are always looking for a new gig, right? We don't necessarily want to put our CV on a recruitment site, but we will passively update our LinkedIn page. And that turned out to be a brilliant consumer insight that he turned into a product, right? So, I think most things in life are about getting feedback, but trusting your own judgment, so not just making decisions because people said it, but saying, I think this, I'm going to just keep on testing it. And you learn from the conversations that you have, and it's just about thinking, learning, iterating, etc. There's no shortcuts except chapter 4 of my book. Yes, please. Yeah. I see lots of questions, so I don't know who's doing.
So you said that things go through cycles.
Yes.
When do you think the tech cycle will stop?
So I think we're in that second half of the 60 to 70 year cycle. And Carlota Perez would say that turning point is particularly long. She thinks it's a 10-year period because of the banking crisis and our inability to kind of, realign financial services to industry, right? And I would agree. I think that financial services is not an industry. It's a service industry to industry. And that's what the bankers don't seem to understand, is that they need to be measuring themselves based on overall their impact on the GDP of the economy, not how many derivatives they sold and whether or not even that they were profitable. Are they backing the industrialists of the day and driving the overall growth? So because that turning point is a very large turning point, we are, I showed you the examples of the David and Goliath deals. We are moving into that second half of the cycle where it's all about big business engaging with the digital enablers to it. But that could be another 30 to 40 years, right? So it could be a very long cycle indeed. But I think it's important that we get the word out that technology is not an industry. It's a layer. It's a layer, and it's driving growth. It doesn't leave people behind. Even as jobs are changing, overall the benefit on the consumer side to people in terms of dropping the cost of technology drops the cost of products and services that consumers then benefit from. And so we could have a whole session on that. But we don't see that being discussed in, the business media and the Sunday papers on news nights, et cetera. And I think that's just a grievous omission because as a result, people are scared. They feel that, the economy's not doing well, we've got downgraded, is it austerity, is it this, is it Keynes, is it Hayek, and they're scared as opposed to thinking that this sorts itself out, right? And the faster and the more we embrace it, the more we get to the future. And we will, of course, get our AAA credit rating back, but it won't be because of anything that the bankers do, it'll be because of what the entrepreneurs do, right? And the entrepreneurs understand the future. Back to the face of that little guy. The entrepreneurs are leveraging the technologies and the disruptive economics and bringing that future to us and fundamentally creating the businesses which are creating the expanding pie. And that, to me, is what's so important, that we get that discussed and understood by more people. Because if you're scared, you're paralyzed. You can't actually be a productive member of society. You can't find your natural unfair advantage and make your contribution to society if you're scared about getting left behind. I think we had a question in the back, please. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Julie. My name is Vanessa. I'm a fourth-year engineering, economics, and management student here at New College, and I'm also the VC Relations Director for Oxford Entrepreneurs. I think it's absolutely incredible what you've done and starting a VC, and I'd love to maybe have some insights from you into what challenges you faced and what inspired you whilst starting the VC firm, especially in such a male-dominated industry.
Well, I'll let you in on a little secret, Vanessa. I have never thought it was a male-dominated world. I really don't. The whole chapter of my book is the world is becoming feminine, and I don't want that to freak out any of the men in the audience, right? What I mean by that is that the kind of leadership characteristics which typically get kind of, I've taken all the good ones and called them feminine, right? Emotional intelligence, trust, all of the rest of it. Of course, men can have these equally. It's just, I'm just trying to be funny. Basically, women understand, that, because we're wired that way, that the world's gone network, right? If you are a woman, you are nodding in agreement right now because we just naturally think that way. Alistair Lukes, who I mentioned, is one of the most feminine people I know. The reason why he was able to sell into the bank so exceptionally well is because sales is all about understanding the person that's opposite you. It's listening, it's influencing, it's care, it's building the bigger. And Alistair is amazing at that, right? So he would be my candidate number one for successful feminine leadership characteristics. So I would say it's not about men or women. I would say it's about understanding what characteristics make a leader today. And I think leaders are people who create the conditions of trust so that great things can happen. And they are fundamentally concerned about bringing everybody with them, right? And saying, how do we? Because there's really two ghettos that we can fall into. We can fall into the ghetto of dependency, and there's a certain part of population that gets very angry about people who might be on benefits and so forth and say they're lazy, blah, blah, blah. But there's a ghetto of independence, hyper-independence, right? People who say, hey, economics work really well for me, and I don't really care if it works for anybody else in society. And that is also a ghetto. And what I think entrepreneurs do, in fact, I know that they do, there are obviously some entrepreneurs that are, real jerks and so forth, but most entrepreneurs are very generous people, and they have been helped along the way, and so they try to help, and they create enormous goodwill, generosity, because first and foremost, they're accountable. They know that thin line between success and failure, and so they've been helped, and they want to give back. That's very positive. And they are, I would argue that sustainability is going to be one of those funny words that just kind of disappears because good business will have to be sustainable. So in the way that I approached my own business, which was your question, and why did I do that, I did look around after I sold my last business First Tuesday. And I kind of said, I'm not sure anybody kind of understands the same things that I do, because as I was running around building First Tuesday in 98, 99, I could see that the world was going network. I built a network of entrepreneurs. I could see that the world was becoming feminine. I could see the rise of the individual capitalist. And I said, and to be honest, I wasn't really, despite having built and sold my own business, I wasn't sure I was a David. It just hadn't really hit me yet. Until I said, you know what, I got to do this on my own, because it became very clear to me what my unfair advantage was. And I thought I'm best able to do that if I set up my own firm, and I'm really happy that I did. So another question, please. We've got a question right here.
Yeah, Julie, terrific talk you've given, and it overlaps with the talks yesterday. There's certain analysis to everything. But I think all of us here today, they're all probably around the average age of 24, let's say. And what they're all thinking while you're talking is, have I got it in me? Have I done the right things to copy Julie? Can you just give them a minute or two about what you did from the age of 18 to 24? Because that's where these people are from.
So, if somebody had said to me when I was going to university at age 18 or even leaving university, I was an English literature major. I'd played a lot of sports, very competitive with myself personality, and very much interested in ideas and how ideas throughout history have kind of jostled for power in the market. So business for me is really about those ideas jostling for dominance in the market. I'm not an engineer, but by virtue of working with technologists for 25 years now, I can more or less hold my own with technology. But I don't ascribe to it some sort of godlike status. I'm interested in the ideas which become dominant in the market. So whereas I wouldn't have, if somebody had said that to me at age 20 as I was going to Paris and getting on the airplane, you'll be running your own venture firm when you're 46 years old, I wouldn't have known what they were saying. I'm not, vaguely, I think I really became aware of venture capital through the technology work that I did, and then going to business school, getting an additional toolkit, right, understanding valuation, corporate finance, and so forth. And I just kept on adding to my toolkit. I think the thing that I was so lucky, because I do have the best parents in the world, sorry, I'm sure you do too, but I have very much the best parents in the world, is that, and my father, who is an entrepreneur, he would say something, he was very busy, but he always said just one thing: anything you set your mind to, you can do. And it's amazing how I just kind of pull that out when I need it. I would say, well, my dad says anything I set my mind to, I can do. But he also said, just invest in yourself. So I have, I think, relentlessly, and some people would say it's very selfishly, just continued to expand my toolkit. I'm fascinated by learning. I love listening to people's, and I pinch ideas and stories and tools and everything from anybody because I just love to learn. And so I pull it into my toolkit. And I try to give back as much as possible, again, as an entrepreneur. But those are, I think, the kinds of things. And I kind of write some key pivotal things that happened to me in my book. Like when I went to Paris, I decided I wanted to go to INSEAD, and so I set a goal. And I'm somebody who all my life has set kind of 7 to 10 year goals, but I don't tell anybody, right? So I won't tell you what my next one is. But as a result of that, I have this kind of true north, and I can measure myself. And so as a result, things will happen which will get in the way of you achieving your goal. But you're just kind of hanging on. You said, but I got to get to the top of the mountain. I don't know how. And okay, it seems like I've taken a detour here, but it keeps you going. And I find that goal setting really drives me to achieve, because it means that I don't get depressed. And it's so hard, because I think you have to be optimistic. And some days you just have to put on your optimism like a piece of clothing, because you just don't feel it, right? And you have to kind of play a game with yourself to say, not sure how I'm going to do it, but I'm so excited that I get to do this thing that I'm really not excited about doing. So I think I've learned some kind of ways of dealing with stress, achievement, and those are the kind of things. But overall, it's been, my 20s were this big, long, windy thing, which was kind of rather amazing that it ended up going to INSEAD. But what happened by virtue of benchmarking myself against my peer group at INSEAD, I was able to see unequivocally what my strengths were and what my weaknesses were. And probably the biggest thing that happened to me when I was 30 years old is I thought, Julie, don't try to fix your weaknesses anymore, because you can't. It is game over on weaknesses, and I won't tell you what they are, but I figured out what my strengths were. And as soon as I started playing to my strengths as opposed to trying to fix my weaknesses, things started to really accelerate. And that was quite a major discovery, actually, because then understanding what my strengths were and playing to my strengths, I figured out kind of what my unfair advantage was. And that led me to understanding what my unique contribution is. And the thing about understanding your unique contribution is you don't want to do anything other than deliver it. You jump out of bed. You don't want to watch bad TV. You don't want to spend time with people that you don't like. You really are so focused on delivering your unique contribution, because it is unique. It is what you are here to do. That it's just great. It's even on a bad day, it's a good day, because you figured it out. And I was a late bloomer. It took me a long time. So, I'm sure you guys are going to figure out yours a lot sooner than me. Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Great, thank you.